Well, let's go ahead and get started then, and I will do a brief introduction. As many of you have seen, we have a fantastic presenter and guest with us tonight, Janice Crouse, and we are so honored to have such a person joining us. Many of you have had the chance to read through all of her, well, it's probably not all, but much of her bio. She is a recognized authority, national and international issues. She is an author, a columnist, and a media commentator. She leads and heads the Crouse Institute, Strengthening Faith, Family, and Culture. And the exciting part for us, because in the Salt Lake City area, at least, she was formerly the executive director of the World Congress of Families. And
which was one of the most exciting experiences I've ever had. I really enjoyed that. And I loved being out there with you guys in Salt Lake City.
Oh, it was such a treat for us to be able to host that and to have that right here in our backyard. I, without further ado, will not continue to read. She is a renowned speaker all over the world, really. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I am going to turn the time over to you.
Well, this week I watched The Bachelor. I've not watched that series. I watched it for a long time when I was writing about cultural issues all the time. So I was interested in this one because it's caused a lot of controversy. And particularly this last week, the garbage hit the fan. Everything just kind of exploded. And there are rumors that all the girls went home and the bachelors kind of left hanging. So I was very curious about what had happened. So I watched the episode. It was the episode where they have overnight fantasy dates. And it's the last episode before the final, when he picks this final woman. And there are three women left: Susie, Rachel, and Gabby. They always have a dinner, and after that dinner, they have the invitation to go to the fantasy suite or not. And at this particular episode, he started with Gabby, and while they're talking at dinner, he tells her he loves her, and he says he is crazy about her and wants to go to the next level. And so he asked her to go to this fantasy suite, and she does. So it felt very manipulative that he says he loved her just before he pulls the envelope out to ask her for the fantasy suite. Then he did exactly the same thing with the next girl, Rachel. And during those dates and the overnights, Susie, who he had previously said he loved and had strong feelings for her, and later told her that she was his favorite one, she worried a lot. And they showed her pondering, surely he wouldn't sleep with them. Surely he wouldn't, after saying he loved her, go to bed with the other women. This seems, really, surely if he loved her, he would not do that. And if he did that, she could not go forward with the relationship. So when she had her date with him the next night, she tells him that essentially. She says, if you did that, what did I just do? Oh, he says, if you did that, she said, if you did that, I cannot go farther with this relationship. Well, he just feels like he's blindsided. And he says, what do you mean? Why didn't you tell me earlier? And she says, but I didn't think I would need to. Blah, blah, blah. So she's all confused, and she's crying, and he's crying, and he's all upset. Finally, he just kind of blows a fuse and says he was blindsided. And he says it's all her fault, and she should have told him beforehand, and so forth. So it ends up with everybody taking sides. And I start with this story because I think that it illustrates the problems with casual sex. And that whole show, as a matter of fact, really illustrates the problem. The participants all, of course, buy into the myths, and their gut feelings eventually rise to the surface, and they realize that there's some things that are unchangeable. There's some realities that you can't do anything about. Despite all the myths, most women do want to have a marriage. They want the romance. They want to have children. They want a whole family. But today's young people have bought into these myths. And in a nutshell, I think the show that I watched was an example of the sexual revolution, because the rules have changed and the standards are no longer there, and there are no absolutes. So these young people today haven't the foggiest idea how to navigate the undercurrents and all the boulders and all the turbulent waters that they have to go through. So they're left on their own. And I'd like for you to look back with me for a minute to an article that was a cover story, as a matter of fact, of Newsweek, called this was 2010. So it's a good 12 years or so ago, The Case Against Marriage. This was published after some 40 years of glorifying casual sex. And now, after 40 years of that and the cover story, The Case Against Marriage, now it's estimated that more than 60% of couples that get married have previously had sex. And this is even amongst couples that are supposed to be Christian. So casual sex today is considered to be very sophisticated, very glamorized. From middle school on, they're all sorts of myths. Sex will make you popular. Sex is make you happy. It's free. It's fun. Girls are told, if you want a boyfriend, you've got to give them sex. If you want a man to marry, you've got to give him sex. So I think it's past time that we have some very serious talk, some very straightforward talk about casual sex. So tonight I'd like us to look at 5 different truths, because there are 35 million kids today who are affected by divorce, and 43 million abortions, 10 million STDs every year, a third of all children are born out of wedlock, 50 million women live alone, cohabitation has increased tenfold. You know all that. You've heard those statistics before. But let's look at the first truth, and we're going to look at 5 of them. And that is that casual sex impairs bonding. And young people don't know that. We've said nothing about that. We haven't taught them that fact. And yet this, thank you. My husband just put the plug in on my phone so it wouldn't run out. That's a good thing to do. Back in 1980, Dr. Donald Joy published some research that is just very, very significant. And by the way, he was a friend of ours. After he retired, he moved to my husband's hometown, and we got to know him that way. But we'd previously seen the research that he had done. And he talks about how intimacy produces oxytocin and bonding. That's something that we take for granted today, and people know that. And yet we don't say to young people, if you sleep around, you're not going to be able to have as strong a bond, and it'll be much more difficult for you to have a bond. I think one of the really beneficial things about the horrible marriage that Prince Charles and Diana had was that she brought to the public's eye the fact that you can't have a third person in a marriage. You can't have 3, 4, 5 in a marriage. It makes a difference, and it affects the relationship in very profound ways. And so I think it's really important to look at the fact that casual sex impairs bonding. But we knew that. Plato said that way back when. He said, love creates bonds. And in 1809, Goethe said that marriage unites human beings in the same way that chemical combinations produce certain results. You can count on it just as much as you can in the human realm, just like you can when you provide certain bondings in chemistry. Dr. Miriam Grossman, who's one of my favorite writers and researchers, is a psychologist, a psychiatrist. In her book, Unprotected, if you haven't read that, I really recommend it, because she's looking at things from the point of view of a university counselor. And she talks about how political correctness has left our young people, both male and female, unprotected, and how the increase in depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and self-abuse are just very dramatic. And yet counselors' hands are tied, and they can't talk to young people and tell them that. And a neuropsychologist, described what I thought was very funny, the typical progression today in a Tinder generation, the Tinder online dating site. He says, when you first meet him, he's passable. The second date, he's okay. By the third date, you have sex. And by the fourth date, you can't imagine life without him. And, I think back to that show that I watched, The Bachelor. This show has, I think this is a 21st season or something like that. Something like 5-6 million people watched that. And most of them are in the demographic of 15 to 30, 45 years old. So it's extremely popular show, has tremendous influence on what dating is like. And yet, I think there are only 4 or 5, I should have looked that up, couples who come out of all those 20-something sessions, different series that have stuck together. And typically they break up within 2 or 3 months. That doesn't surprise us, but everybody's, oh, I thought that one would last, and so forth. So young people don't understand that casual sex has consequences, and that it's not just a matter of you have chemistry between you. Marriage takes much more than that. Having a relationship takes much more than that. So the bottom line is that sex does have consequences. The cocktail of chemicals that are released when there's closeness and touching between a couple is very powerful. It's very long lasting, and it has specific, very long lasting results. So let's look at truth number 2. Casual sex leaves young people alone and lonely. You just can't ignore nature. You can't dictate to nature and say, I'm not going to pay any attention to that. I'm not going to follow that basic fact, that basic reality. We have to tell young people how important it is to have self-discipline and self-control, not just in your youth, but the rest of your life. That's important in so many areas. Why would it not be important in your relationships? Dr. Meg Meeker has written, casual sex routinely leads to emotional turmoil and psychological distress, empty relationships, self-contempt, and feelings of unworthiness. I spent about 10 years of my life as Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, where I was in charge of students who were having academic problems or students who were succeeding. The 2 extremes were my responsibility. And I found over and over again, when I started talking to somebody who was having academic problems, all too frequently, they had just been rejected by someone they had sex with. So there's stunning statistics too that back that up. 72% of girls and 55% of guys regret having early sexual activity and wish that they had waited. And yet, we even STDs, for which there are no cures. We only treat the symptoms of it. And yet we consider sex no big deal, even when that's one of the consequences. And some STDs cause infertility, and they are rampant, and particularly amongst the college age and up to age 25. The campaign to call STDs, you'll find this really interesting. I think I had suspected this for a long time, but I served on a task force on teen sexuality. And the task force was supposed to find ways to help teens say no to sex. Well, when they switched over from STDs to STIs, sexually transmitted diseases to sexually transmitted infections, I asked that group, because they were people from Planned Parenthood and SICAS and all those groups. And I said, why was that change made when everybody's used to STDs? And they said it's because infections are considered more serious than diseases, and less serious, than diseases. So they switched the terminology, hoping that they could ease some of the tension that young people felt in terms of STDs. Again, our young people are left alone to travel through all these relationships, and they're lonely. They are alone and they're lonely and they stay confused and perplexed when their feelings and their emotions and their reactions don't conform to what the media has glamorized, and the myths that surround their lives just don't add up to what they are experiencing. Truth number 3, the sexual revolution has unleashed a pandemic of STDs and a flood of non-marital childbearing and increased infertility. We haven't let kids know how very serious STDs are. And yet the CDC reports that they've reached all-time highs last year for the 6th consecutive year. Back in 2014 was 1.9 million of them, 2015, 2 million, 2016, 2.2, and on up to 2019, 2.6 million. And in 2021, the CDC reported there are more than 20 million new STDs every single year. Wow, that's just stunning, absolutely stunning. And yet we continue to make light of STDs, that they're easily cured or controlled. That's the myth that's out there. And yet many people will be dealing with those symptoms and the consequences for the rest of their lives. The latest data among people who have had sexual partners more than 15, can you imagine? Amongst Black men, the percentage is 30% who've had 15 or more partners. White men, 21% have had 15 or more. Hispanic men, 19%. Black women, 11%. White women, 8.9%. And Hispanics, 4.4%. Wow, it's amazing. Out of wedlock births have mushroomed between 1970 and 2009. In the US, from 11% to 40%. UK, 8% to 46%. Germany's STD rates have jumped from, out of wedlock births have jumped from 4 times since 1970. Infertility rates up more than 10% per decade. Per decade. Wow. More than 50% over 50 years. Sperm counts at the same time have declined 50% in 40 years. Truth number 4, casual sex is dangerous in the age of HIV/AIDS. And it's a myth that everyone is vulnerable to sex, to HIV/AIDS. Today's public in this area is just as misinformed as other areas and just as unprotected. We treat HIV very differently from any other public health threat. It's a public health threat. And yet doctors who must report on 50 different communicable diseases, and the people who have those diseases must get treatment or they'll go to jail, we don't require doctors to disclose. In fact, US laws prohibit them from disclosing anyone's HIV status. And we use code names for people who have HIV tests so that their status is only known if they choose voluntarily to let it be known. And we use the politically correct phrase, anybody can get HIV/AIDS. Almost every month they change the signs on the sides of the buses in DC. And invariably there's something about HIV/AIDS. Do you know your status? Everybody can get HIV. Go get tested. It's just amazing to me, the campaign that is protecting the facts about that disease. But the truth is, truth number 4, is that there are only 3 ways you can get HIV/AIDS. Intimate sexual contact with somebody who already has HIV/AIDS, share contaminated needles with someone who has HIV/AIDS, or a health worker who comes in contact with the bodily fluids of someone who has HIV/AIDS. Those are the only people who are vulnerable. There's also the myth that women are the new face of HIV/AIDS. That's one of the bus signs that I see on a rotating basis. It's almost exclusively HIV/AIDS is almost exclusively a homosexual male and drug addict epidemic. Do I need to say that again? In the US, though, there are 40,000 HIV cases every year, and more than 900,000 people live with HIV, with 250,000 estimated don't know they are infected. The CDC even has campaigns to keep people from being non-judgmental and to develop cultural sensitivity. I'm sorry? I don't know what just happened there. The CDC identifies racism, discrimination, stigma, and homophobia as the real causes for the spread of the epidemic. And the privacy campaign that the gays initiated won voluntary and anonymous testing and no requirement for partner notification, excuse me. The billboards still continue to proclaim HIV is here to stay and anybody can get HIV and women are the face of the AIDS. But the truth is, as I said, it's spread only by anal intercourse and sharing needles or having a sexual partner who does those things. So sexual truth number 5, casual sex is harmful to long-term well-being. Our young people know the myths and they know the mechanics of sex, but they have absolutely no comprehension of the magic, the mystery, the meaning of a man knowing a woman, to use the biblical term. So many fallacious reverberations are across our culture because they don't know that. Sex is very much a big deal. To know is laden with all sorts of meaning. Sexual intercourse means intimate, private knowledge of your personhood. The raw, unadorned, animalistic side of humanity is exposed. Every person has unique personhood, and that's intensely private. And yet, with casual sex, it's treated as though it's not. Being revealed to another exposes us to the greatest of vulnerabilities, and yet we pretend that's not so. When our rationality is pushed aside and our intellect provides no cover in sexual intercourse, it's important that both partners in a couple are clothed with love and feel safely committed in a permanent relationship. That's the only situation that liberates us from our inhibitions and our innate fears. So anything short of that is counterfeit, and it's a fake experience of intimacy. And when the meaningless is exposed, one or the other of the partners feels betrayed. And that was the thing, I think, that made me start out with that episode from The Bachelor, because they felt betrayed. It became very obvious that they were both destroyed emotionally. So we are harming our young people in very specific ways. In conclusion, we are living in a time of crisis. We all know that. There are some signs that we're potentially threatened by thermonuclear bombs, for crying out loud. Russia has spread fear through all Europe about the beginning of a World War III even. Domestically, things seem to be out of control with inflation, corruption, shortages, crime. There are so many problems that completely overshadow the problems of cohabitation, the problems of casual sex, the problems of the decline in commitment, the problems of the decline in marriage. There's so many things that overshadow these very central things to the formation of family that are doing such harm to women and children. What are we going to do? You are a discussion group talking about the home front, and how do you participate on the front lines of these cultural wars? And what are the possibilities for you? Whether, we all have local spheres and areas of influence. I'm basically retired now, and this is the first thing I've done for after 6 months of unbelievable pain and being mostly bedridden from hip and leg pain from sciatica, being in the hospital from withdrawal from oxycodone that they gave me to help with that and to help me get through that. It's been a tough, tough time. And so I look at my own life and I say, okay, what can I do? And I accepted this invitation. Thank you, Marcia, so very much, because I can do this. I can sit in front of a camera. Apparently, I can't get my new computer to work, but I can sit in front of a camera. We each need to examine our hearts and our schedules and see what it is we can do and where we can step in and raise awareness to the harms of the sexual revolution and casual sex. Okay, the floor is yours to talk and add your wisdom to the conversation.
Oh, Janice, thank you so very much. That was such amazing groundwork for us. There are a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is, what do you think of the push to have children vaccinated against HPV or Gardasil, especially since you don't get HPV with engaging in sexual behavior with someone who has HPV? So that would be the first question. Then there's another one.
And the shot is only good for 5 years, and they're recommending kids to have it at 11, for crying out loud. That doesn't make any sense. Are we going to put a stamp of approval on having sex between the 11 and 15? I mean, I don't know anybody who recommends that. The farthest left people get disturbed about childhood sex. So I don't know why they would say that. I wrote a paper and did a lot of research and talked with the people who were pushing the HPV. It's a very dangerous drug, and it's ridiculous, I think, to have a widespread vaccination of children when hopefully our children have been taught not to have casual sex. And to assume that children are going to do that, I think, is a huge mistake.
It is amazing to me, for sure, how much that is pushed on very young children, and how much I see and hear of it just on television and everything. Oh,
women tell me that Christians are insisting that they inoculate their children. And I'm just going like, oh my word.
Yeah, crazy. All right, continuing on with another question. Groups like CEICUS and Planned Parenthood push a narrative of sex positive and pleasure. How do we combat their sexual liberty narrative without sounding like we oppose pleasure or that think sex is a bad thing?
That's such a challenge, and I don't have the answers to that because we do come across as sounding so prudish, and yet the facts, something I should have covered already in the things that I covered. Happily married people have the best sex. The research is resounding on that subject. So if you want to have good sex, it's not with casual sex. There's all sorts of research showing that one of the keys to having intimacy and good sex is, I'm speaking really bluntly here, I'm assuming these are all women, right?
Well, there's a couple of men.
Well, that's okay, but no children.
Oh, yeah, no, yes.
Um, now I forgot what I was saying.
As far as the pleasure,
Oh, okay.
happily married.
Sex. Research shows having intimacy and good sex is, that's where you left off.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. You have to have trust. You have to feel secure. And you can't tell me that a girl who has just met some guy, I don't care how good looking he is or how well built he is or anything else, they are not going to have good sex. Or I should say the best sex. And married couples have more sex. I've forgotten the statistics on that, but there's a hierarchy of frequency of sex and satisfaction with sex. And the very highest is married people, and the very lowest is people who are casual.
So amazing that the research is out there for us, right? Okay.
And it has been for a long time.
Yeah.
And the interesting and more amazing than that is that it's pretty much across the board. I mean, it's not just conservative research. It's across the board, liberal research as well. And yet they're unwilling to say that. And I told you about being on that task force. It was supposed to be a bipartisan thing. And I really didn't have time to do that because it was going to be, I think, twice a month for about a year and a half. But I decided to do it. And I got there, and it was supposed to be balanced too, bipartisan. Got there, and there were only two conservatives, and the other conservative knew nothing about policy. And besides that, wasn't very talkative, did not participate hardly at all. So I was left to carry the ball. And it was astounding to me. I shouldn't have been shocked because it happens over and over and over again. Anytime you have a task force like that dedicated to reaching common ground on some issue, I thought at least we could come to an agreement that kids ought not to have sex. And I drew up a little food chart, the charts that start with the basic needs and go up to the top. And at the top of it, I had the birds and bees because when it comes to sex education, that's the smallest, least significant part of it. And at the bottom, I had values that you're to teach kids about sex. We need to start with values, how important it is to respect each other and so forth. And I made the point that we didn't have to specify Christian values, biblical values, or secular values, or progressive values. We didn't have to say that, just values, period. And people across the whole United States, like they do with the food diagram, they could choose their own values there. But, values such as self-respect are not ideological. Some of us would add biblical and so forth, but not everybody has to. And everybody loved it. I mean, there were some 30 people on that task force, and they just were, oh, this is so great. And then they put it on hold and said, everybody go back and, work on it and see if you made any improvement, and we'll vote on it next time. Well, the next meeting, they completely trashed it. And I found out that Planned Parenthood and SECUS and they had all met, and they didn't like the idea of values. Values had nothing to do with sex. And, somebody might come along and specify certain values. So when it came right down to it, at the end of the whole thing, the conservatives either have to totally cave or the whole thing falls apart. And if it falls apart, then it's the conservatives' fault, right, Wendy? That's what you run into at the UN all the time, Marcia.
Yeah.
True.
It is frustrating getting the word out there, so to speak. So that leads perfectly into the next question, Marcia. And again, I'm just going straight down through them. How do we turn back the clock then, societally and culturally, and return to an understanding that sexual behavior should be any ideas, which goes back to getting the word out there, looking at the research, because as Janice has mentioned, it's abundant, it's out there. The research is there.
Yes.
So any thoughts on? Go ahead.
That keeps me awake at night, actually, because I have grandchildren, and they are very important to me. And the culture we live in it's almost impossible to insulate them against that kind of culture and all the influences of that culture. And I cared very deeply about young people. For some reason, they've always been, they have a very special place in my heart. I think individually, we should all do everything that we possibly can. When you broaden it to the United States, I look at what's happening in our culture, and, in the church, the loss of influence of the church on our culture, the loss of biblical values in the public square, all those things. I don't know how we reverse that. Part of me says that it's going to take some kind of drastic, horrendous kind of upheaval or a revival. I remember back probably 20 years ago, I gave a speech at a number of colleges and ended it with the fact that at that time, about 20 years ago, a number of people who we respect very much, who are writers, and amongst them was George Will. I remember that because I was shocked by him being amongst them. I had about 5 different people who had said, and it shocked me that there was this agreement and that they all said the same kind of thing, that the only hope for restoring biblical values into the culture was a John Wesley type revival. Remember the world revivals?
Yeah. My gracious sakes. Oh, so many thoughts coming through here, not only for me, but for others as we move on in this conversation, which leads then this whole thing into perfect one from Sarah that says, in a world full of misinformation then and outright lies, do we have any, and you particularly, Janice, any recommendation for good sex ed curriculum for our young people? Is there anything out there that we can refer to?
Wow, that is a really good question, and I don't know the answer to it. I wish I did, and I am so interested in it. I'm going to very promptly go see if I can find the answer to that question. But I'm really sorry that I don't know now. I am not familiar at all with any really good sex ed curriculums. The only ones I know are the bad ones.
Yeah, that's, I think that's probably how the rest of us feel too. And especially bringing up something that Jesse said, in terms of the normalization of childhood sex. There's such a strong push and such a strong movement towards normalizing child sex that anything that we can find to equip ourselves with better information.
Hey, there's a push for pedophilia.
Yeah.
I gave a speech to the Concerned Women for America directors about 15 years ago. And in that, I said I hesitated to bring this up, but I had seen some efforts to normalize pedophilia. And I felt like that was another front that the left was going to push. Well, it has happened so much faster than I ever thought it would. it's amazing to me. I just cannot imagine anybody getting on board with that. How in the world could anybody put a stamp of approval on assaulting a child?
Yeah, it's for most of us here, all of us here, I'm sure that's, yeah. Apparently, there is good sex education curriculum found at weascend.org. And according to the comments in the chat, they review sexual risk avoidance curricula and give study results for each of them. This is coming through to us from the Alliance to Protect Children. So,
Teresa, do you mind emailing that to me or texting that to me?
You bet. I'd be happy to. Not
Thank
a
you.
problem at all.
Any of the rest of you who hear of good programs, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. How do we increase exposure and engagement in premarital education for couples to teach healthy relationship skills, including healthy sexual intimacy?
That's one of the things that breaks my heart about the lack of influence in the church, and the fact that younger people are leaving the church. This is a huge problem in the Protestant denominations, and the church is the best place for them to get premarital education and education in terms of relationships and period. So when you don't have a church that backs up the family, it's very difficult to find quality premarital counseling. There are Christian counselors, of course, but I don't think of that in terms, I don't think of premarital counseling being the role of a psychologist. You know, I think more, to me, it seems more the role of a priest or a minister, someone who's grounded in biblical principles.
Yeah. Okay, I know we do need to wrap up, but I'm so engaged in all of this, and I'm so pleased with everyone's comments and questions coming in. There are a couple of other, Camille has given us a website, Wheatley Institute, BYU Ed, the Inescapable Ethics for Sex Education. So I will send that out to everyone, that particular website. And oh, go ahead. Oh, I thought somebody had another question in there.
You don't have to stop on my account. I'm a night owl.
Oh. Well, you must really be, because I know what time it is where you're at. Oh my goodness. Well, we appreciate your time. Are there any other questions? Anybody want to, I think we've made it, I think we, Amelia, see if I missed anything. I
really applaud the LDS Church for what I have perceived and what I saw when I was in Salt Lake City. It seemed to me that you do a better job of reaching your young people and keeping them in church. One of the neatest experiences I had out there was attending church, because there was a mixture of generations that I haven't seen since my childhood in church. You know, there were children, there were teenagers, there were so many middle school boys, so many high school and young adult men. And that's where we Protestants have lost the battle. Now we're losing the young women too, but at least we have some young women remain. But it's very rare to have my granddaughters say, for instance, they're all dating age, that any young adult kind of fellowship at the churches that they have gone to it's 98% women. There may be 2 men or 3 men. Well, what kind of future do our young women have when that's the case? When our colleges are 60, 70% women. I don't know if you read the work of Mark Regnerus, but that's really scary. The economics of sex. That would be a good topic for one of your front discussions, because the economics of sex is a really laden topic.
Yeah, I can imagine that it would be. One of the things that I did skip over, this is kind of going backwards just a little bit, but they're here in our area, and one of our listeners tonight, Camille, brought this up, that some doctors are recommending the HPV vaccine just in case a child marries someone with an STI or an STD, or in the case of date rape and assaults and things like that. So we've got, even from the doctor and medical side of things, the concern that it's being pushed so much, and to young kids. So
Yeah,
even that we see on television are just amazing to me. I mean, loud.
I've had women say that their doctors treat them like they're ignoramuses when they say, that's not needed with my children, I'm not doing that. And the pressure exerted in some instances from the women I've talked to has been very strenuous.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
not
yeah.
right. To push things that hard and to make a parent feel inadequate and have to stand out.
Yeah, even from a personal standpoint, when my daughter started seeing, just because a gynecologist, and she's maturation age, and of course as time goes on, it's good for her, and that was one of the very first things that the physician talked to her about, and she said, "Mom, I don't even know what they're talking about. What did the doctor mean?" I'm like, well, let me explain this a little bit more.
And wanting to put teenagers in birth control.
Right.
Same kind of battle parents have to fight there.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, this has been so awesome. Let's see. Anyone else have any comments now? Open mic for just a second as we conclude tonight.
Marcia had one comment. She said, definitely look up Mark Regenerus. His work is very informative and helpful. Oh, you know him. Okay, so anyway, helpful in understanding the cultural mix and diversity in which we live.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I was interested in that myself, being someone with a little bit of a finance background, or a lot of a finance background, the economics of sex.
It's not as much economics as he focuses on the fact that guys have the upper hand, and that they will marry the A girls by the time they are out of college. And if a girl is not married by the end of college, I believe he says very specifically, her chances of getting married drop precipitously. If I'm remembering right, he said that very bluntly. But he does talk about the fact that men have the upper hand, and every year a girl's chance of getting married declines. And that's the kind of economics that he's referring to.
Right. Yeah. And I can see the correlation there for sure.
Right.
All right. Janice, thank you so very much. This has been fantastic, and such great depth and groundwork for our hosts to go forward with their individual groups. Thank you. Thank you so very much for for
Thank
being
you
here
so
with
much
us tonight.
asking me to do it. It's just been a delightful evening. You know, these are friends. I have enjoyed getting to know so many of you, and it's just really a joy to interact with you now.